If you'll turn with me to our scriptures today that are in your bulletin. There's a lot of scriptures, isn't it? Some of you are getting heartburn. We'll never get out of here. But that's okay. I'm going to be fairly brief, even though the scriptures are long. I didn't want you to miss anything about the resurrection and the role that these strong women that surrounded Jesus had. Luke 8, 1 through 3, 23 to 50 and 56, and then 24, 1 through 12. Jesus continued according to plan, traveled town to town, village to village, preaching God's kingdom, spreading the message. The 12 were with him. There were also some women in their company who had been healed of various evil afflictions and illnesses. Mary, the one called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, Joanna, wife of Chuza, Herod's master, and Susanna, along with many others who used their considerable means, financial means, to provide for the company. All who had come around as spectators to watch the crucifixion, when they saw what actually happened when Jesus was murdered on the cross, were overcome with grief and headed home. Those who knew Jesus well, along with the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a respectful distance and kept vigil. There was a man by the name of Joseph, a member of the Jewish High Council, a man of good heart and good character. He had not gone along with the plans and actions of the council. His hometown was the Jewish village of Arimathea. He lived in alert expectation of the kingdom of God. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Taking him down, he wrapped his body in a linen shroud and placed him in a tomb chiseled into the rock, a tomb that had never yet been used. It was the day before Sabbath. The Sabbath had just about to begin. The women who had been companions of Jesus from Galilee followed along. They saw the tomb where Jesus' body was placed. Then they went back to prepare burial spices and perfumes. At the crack of dawn on Sunday, the women came to the tomb carrying burial spices they had prepared. They found the entrance stone rolled back from the tomb, so they walked in. But once inside, they couldn't find the body of the Master Jesus. They were puzzled, wondering what to make of this. Then out of nowhere, it seemed, 2 men, light cascading over them, stood there. The women were awestruck and bowed down in worship. The men said, "Why are you looking for the living one in a cemetery? He is not here, but raised up. Remember how he told you when you were still back in Galilee that he had to be handed over to sinners, be killed on a cross, and 3 days rise up?" Then they remembered Jesus' words. They left the tomb and broke the news of all of this to the 11 and the rest. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them kept telling these things to the apostles. But the apostles didn't believe a word of it, thought they were making it all up. 6 times in this passage, the word women appears. And if you notice, 3 times it said, who had followed him since he began his ministry in Galilee. These were strong women. That's 3 years of being on the road. 3 years of paying for all their lodgings, of paying for all their food, of paying for all their necessities. These were very strong women. Matthew 27:55 sort of amplifies what this Gospel of Luke says. It says, quite a few women were with him. So you had these 3 leading women that are mentioned, but then quite a few women were there. And they knew Jesus well. They knew Jesus almost as well as the 12 apostles. And they had followed him ever since he began in Galilee. That is a real commitment. That is a real commitment. And they followed him to the cross, and they stayed there. They kept vigil at a respectful distance. So from the start, these strong women provided for Jesus and for the disciples. That's an amazing story. When you really get down and parse it out, it's absolutely amazing what they did for Jesus. From the beginning, they've been companions of Jesus. They'd heard most of the words that Jesus has said. They weren't at the Last Supper, but they were everywhere else. And when he died, they stayed there. When Joseph took Jesus' body down, they were there. They followed Joseph of Arimathea to his grave and saw where Jesus was placed. It was a Sabbath, so they couldn't do anything on the Sabbath, but they went home and they got burial spices. And these things are very expensive perfumes and spices, and they prepared them. And it says, I love this translation, it says, at the crack of dawn on Sunday, the women came back to the tomb. The stone was rolled away. They walked in, and no body was there. And suddenly, these two angels in dazzling light showed up. And they said, don't you remember? He said he'd rise from the dead. He's not here, he's risen. And so I'm sure that the women went as fast as they could back to where the 11 disciples were. Now remember, it's 11, not 12, because Judas had betrayed him. And they said, these angels appeared, these men in dazzling light appeared, and told us that he's risen from the dead. And they kept telling them, and telling them, and telling them. You know, at the risk of having somebody beat me up after the service, men are really slow. Men, did you notice how heartily the women laughed? But it's true. We are not in touch with our emotions. The corpus callosum in the human brain in women is 15 to 45% thicker. That's connecting their logical part of their brain with their emotional part. So they feel emotions, and they had a lot of emotions. And even a man would have emotions. If a couple of angels showed up and said he's risen, even dumb men would. But they were really into it, because they were connected up there. Well, the disciples, they were men. They were not connected to their emotions fully. And they had to keep telling them and telling them and telling them. And just a little note, Kathleen's been telling me for years, you need to slow down. You need to slow down. I've not been fully connected until I got disconnected. And I'm starting to slow down now. And how embarrassing is that? How embarrassing was it for the 11 disciples? And they were persistent, though. A really good mom and a really good female friend, if she thinks she's right, am I not right? Will really be persistent. Will not let you go. Jesus told this wonderful story about a widow lady and an unjust judge. She would give that judge no rest until he made justice take place. And he was an unjust judge, and it appears to me he was also a lazy judge. But basically, if you read the scriptures, he said, this widow lady is going to drive me crazy. She's not letting me go. I'm going to do her justice even though I don't want to, because she'll get out of my life, And that's what they were doing to the apostles. They were not letting them go. They got a hold of them. And they kept telling and telling and telling. And to Peter and John, to their credit, they finally got the message. You notice the other 9 stayed there. But Peter and John, finally, they connected their emotions with their logic, And they connected the fact that Jesus really did repeatedly tell them he was going to die and 3 days later be raised from the dead. And they ran to the tomb. And it was exactly like the women said. Exactly like the women said. A similar thing happened to me. A friend of mine, for 3 years, he said, please come to northern Peru with me. Please come. And finally, this is how slow I am, finally, after 3 years, I realized maybe God was telling me to go to Peru. And he was. And that's where I met this wonderful Christian Native American holy man. So what I want to encourage you to do this Easter Sunday is, when God speaks to your heart, and men are going to have to work on this a little bit more than women, try to listen with your emotions as well as with your mind. When God speaks to you, try to say, this may not be just this Bible that's speaking to me. This may not be just my friend that's speaking to me. This may not be just my girlfriend or my fiancé or my wife speaking to me. Maybe God is speaking to me. I have never been to Freedom Friday or any other 12-step meeting, never been without God speaking to me. Since I've become a Christian, I've never been to any church service without God speaking to me. God is constantly speaking to you and me. And sometimes he's spoken to you by angels and you just weren't aware of it. He is not here. He's risen. And I love one of the Gospels says, he is going before you into Galilee. And if you're a believer in Jesus Christ today, I want you to know that Jesus is going before you no matter where you go. Ask for your eyes to be opened. A wonderful story about the men on the road to Emmaus. They were all upset. They thought Jesus was going to be the Messiah, and he was murdered on the cross. And then these women had told them that they'd seen the empty tomb, and these angels said that he was risen, but they hadn't seen Jesus yet, and so they were going back from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which is about 7 to 17 miles away from Jerusalem, and this stranger appeared. Why are you guys talking so intensely? And they told him about Jesus of Nazareth and how he'd been murdered on a cross and how they thought he was going to be the Messiah. And then he began to explain to them all the scriptures that prophesied. And this passage in Isaiah that Dan read today, that's one of the major passages that Jesus used. It's almost word for word a story of Jesus' life, hundreds of years before Jesus was born. What you heard read today is exactly what Jesus was saying to those two men on the Emmaus Road. And so as fast as they could, once they invited Jesus for dinner, and as he had a prayer and he broke the bread after he explained the scriptures to them, he handed it to them and he disappeared, and they realized they had an encounter with Jesus and didn't know it, like you and I do. They immediately went back to Jerusalem and explained everything that had happened. And they said, our hearts were burning within us. Did you hear that song by John Wesley, which we just sang? Our hearts burn within us when God speaks to us. And then suddenly Jesus appeared to them. And it terrified them. And the first thing he says, don't be afraid. And then he says, listen, I'm not a ghost. Do you have anything to eat? Ghosts don't eat. And they gave him fish. And he ate the fish. He was not a ghost. It was not an imagination. The apostles thought that the women at the tomb had a wishful, fantastic, incorrect, hysterical encounter. And it was actually true angels, and Jesus had truly risen. People will make fun of you from time to time for being a Christian. Are you kidding me? You believe these fairy tales? Stephen Hawking, before he died, called the message of Jesus a fairy tale, a children's story. Jesus prophesied that, and the Hebrew Scriptures prophesied that Jesus' message would be known around the world. No matter where you go in any corner of the world today, you mention Jesus of Nazareth, they know who you're talking about. India, China, Africa, Asia, the Americas, everyone knows. They don't know personally many times. A third of the world is nominally Christians, and a fourth of the world is nominally Islamic. And even in Islam, they honor Jesus. They believe everything that you and I believe, except the most important thing. Islamic people do not believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That's the difference. And you and I do. And that makes all the difference in the world. Because it means that Jesus is always with us. This wasn't just a great prophet in the past. He's experienced himself again and again to this world through people like Martin Luther, John Wesley, Billy Graham, great human beings who have obviously been an incarnation of Jesus and prophets of Jesus, sent again and again. In the Hebrew Scriptures, God sent prophets again and again. In Christian history, and one of the things we're studying at the University of the South is in the New Testament and in the last 2,000 years, God has sent men and women of God again and again and again. Jesus is always appearing. Galilee is the backwoods of Israel. That's where Jesus appeared. Women, strong women from the backwoods of Galilee were there. That's surprising to Jewish people in those days. He's supposed to be a son of David. He's supposed to come from Judea. He's supposed to be around Jerusalem somewhere. And he came from out of nowhere. Jesus is going to come, I guarantee you, and I'm prophesying something to you today. Jesus will come out of nowhere in your life to you. He will surprise you. He's going to come out of nowhere. Be ready for it. He appeared to me through a little old cook in the High Sierras at a pack station. He appeared to me with several people in the hospital this week. Jesus is going to show up. Be happy. Be full of peace. Don't worry about the future. You are not alone. And you will never be alone ever again because of the resurrected Jesus. Amen.